You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, I want to welcome our first guest, Phil Terzian. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. I'm almost at a loss of words today. Not just you, but so many of us have been covering this president and have been covering many different issues, whether it be foreign policy, terrorism, our friends and allies, all the conflict zones. But I have never felt, I'm going to call it almost fear. I've never been so afraid for what can happen because of the weakness that we have sitting in the Oval Office right now, and either the decision or the indecision that we face. Could you ever remember a time like this, Phil?
Well, I can remember back in a little after Christmas 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and President Carter said he was surprised and shocked and said that he had learned more about the Soviet Union in the previous 2 weeks than in the previous X number of years, which, I mean, in many ways it was an admirably candid thing to say, but it was also slightly appalling, and especially since the Carter administration had spent the past few years in effect cultivating the Soviet Union. And you may remember his famous speech at Notre Dame where he castigated us for our inordinate fear of communism and so forth and so on. So, I mean, presidents do have their moments, their eureka moments, and Lord knows we're in a moment right now where the consequences of the foreign policy of the last 6 years or so are becoming painfully obvious. So I guess my view is, we're a strong country. We have a lot of allies. Things could be much worse, but it's a somewhat sobering set of circumstances at the moment. That's true.
Well, I think what I find most sobering is that, I haven't looked at it as our country's at war because I feel like, so few of us actually serve in the military. At any one point, what's the max we have? About 1% of our population. Yeah. Overall, it's still a small number. And I think that, first of all, God bless them for what they sacrifice, not just them, but their families and their friends and their loved ones and their communities, because they give so much. And it's not just why they're serving. From the time they get home, they continue to give. And so, it's what we ask them to do. But we go about our lives for the most part. We just discuss it. We, occasionally we read news and feel something, or you witness something bad that happens. But most Americans go about their lives and live the way we do because of those who sacrifice.
Well, sure.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I mean it's true. I mean, partly because of our geography, we're to some degree insulated from what goes on around the world. And that's what you say is absolutely correct. What's discouraging, though, to me is, I mean, it's one thing for when we send soldiers into harm's way and combat takes place and lives are lost and so on. But if there's one thing we've learned in modern history, it's that the mere presence of American troops, whether shots are being fired or not, makes an enormous difference. I mean, we've seen that for the last half century and more in Western Europe. We've seen it on the Korean Peninsula since 1950, even since the armistice in 1953. We see it elsewhere. And the sad thing is that in 2008, when President Obama was elected, Iraq was a stable country. We had defeated the Sunni insurgency. There was a coalition government in Baghdad. Our allies were on board with us, both there and in Afghanistan. We had, the war on terror was being fought in Iraq at that point, and it was being won. And we could have looked forward, I think, to a long but very, very salutary American presence in the area. And you may recall that year, John McCain sort of offhandedly, in answer to a question, once said, well, we may have to have troops in Iraq for 50 or 100 years, who knows? And of course, the roof fell in when he said that. But he was absolutely right. And I mean, South Korea has not become North Korea precisely because we had American troops stationed along the 38th parallel, and very few shots have been fired in those 60 years, but it made a huge difference. And the Obama administration just doesn't believe in the salutary effects of American peacekeeping forces around the world. And it's a lesson that we keep forgetting and relearning all the time.
That's an excellent point that you brought up with regards to North and South Korea. And I think the same could have applied with Vietnam had we made a couple different decisions or tactically have done some things slightly differently, and had, instead of taking down the the South Vietnamese governing body at the time, helping to lead the overthrow, if we had taken the government that was in place and worked with them to try to fix things. And by the way, I think that's sort of the mistake we made in Iraq, because after we took down Saddam Hussein, whether you agreed with going in or not to begin with, there were leadership within the Ba'ath Party or other factions that had enough knowledge of the country and the government themselves that I think to some degree they should have been called upon to help rebuild that country. Instead, we didn't do that, and now we are where we are. For many reasons, but that was certainly one of them.
No, that's a good point. I mean, when you intervene, even when it's in a good cause, you have to undertake the subsequent responsibilities. And part of the problem too is the press. I mean, we've been repeatedly told over the last 6-8 years that the American people are war weary and they want to concentrate on the Emmy Awards and other important things. And the fact is that, of course, the American people are war weary. We were war weary in the middle of the Civil War. We were war weary in the middle of World War II. No one loves and adores war or even the presence of troops overseas. But the function of a political leader is to explain to the American people why we are doing what we are doing, and why, even though it's burdensome and expensive and we'd rather be doing other things, it's really the most important thing we can be doing and best in the long run. And President Obama, I mean, first of all, I think sincerely as a doctrinal matter, I don't think he believes in the American peacekeeping mission around the world. I think he thinks the United States is the cause of a lot of the world's problems, and the more we withdraw, the better off the world will be. That's kind of Democratic Party doctrine since the McGovern era, and I think it's the exact opposite of the truth, and I think the historic evidence bears that out. But that's what you have political leadership for. You say, this is the challenge we face, and we have to rise to it. And because if we don't, the consequences are far worse than anything we're undergoing at the moment, far worse than war weariness.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Now, you have quite a few pieces that you're right, but I was looking at a particular piece that you had, an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, where you're discussing when the U.S. abdicates, disaster usually follows.
Right.
And of course, you brought up the John McCain and some of those particular issues, but now it's not just in some of these areas. I almost feel like even in economic issues in our own hemisphere, when you look at South and Central America, I think that we've sort of abandoned dealing with some of these particular issues, and of course, I believe that is what has led to this, somewhat immigration crisis that we've had on the border recently. And it's just another example. But the only problem is that this is all happening at the same time when you have a China who's becoming more belligerent, more powerful, that they are aggressively looking towards advanced space programs, advanced military programs. And of course, these are all, they're not being run by 535 members in Congress and an administration. They're running by a core of power, right, that could do basically whatever they want. And then of course we all understand what Russia's doing right now. But these are very critical and dangerous times. And I think you're right. I think your headline is perfect. Let's just put it that way.
Well, you raise a very important point. I mean, when we we'll, not to put too fine a point on it, but when we retreat from the Middle East, as we have very deliberately and very comprehensively in the past few years, it isn't just the people in the Middle East who see what's going on. The whole world takes notice. And, I mean, my view is that, we live in a Hobbesian world. We don't live in the peaceable kingdom. And when countries like China, when people like President Putin, and people even in our own hemisphere see that the United States is pulling back, is retreating, is abjuring itself of its responsibilities, is making it clear it's not going to do anything to force its preferences, they take notice, and that creates a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled. And it doesn't just get filled in Iraq, as we're seeing spectacularly with the sudden rise of ISIS, or the Islamic State, but we see it in Ukraine, we see it in East Asia with China, where our longtime allies like Japan and South Korea and the Philippines are at the moment kind of looking at each other and wondering, can we really depend on the United States in the future? And a lot of people will say, well, we've had troops in Korea for a half century. The Japanese are a rich country. By God, they should step up and defend themselves. Well, that doesn't happen overnight. And there's really only one power in the world that can make a difference, and it's the United States of America. And if the political leadership of the United States of America doesn't believe that, or worse, thinks that American influence is bad and not good, then you have the circumstances that we're witnessing today in all the hemispheres.
No, that's another good point. And so let me ask you, it's very easy for us to discuss the what's going wrong, the where did we fail, who's doing what. But at this point, what are the answers that we should be suggesting as we're looking for, I guess because we don't have a strategy yet, but we really need one very fast?
Well,
which,
obviously.
By the way, that statement is incredible. I really can't believe that at this point he's still making them.
Well, give him credit for candor. I think that, obviously we want what's best for the country. I mean, there's a political dimension to this, and if you're a Republican, you're looking ahead to 2016, and what can we say or do that will make this argument, especially if the Democratic nominee is President Obama's Secretary of State. So that's an interesting question, but we have an immediate problem that affects all Americans. I mean, I have to say the only thing you can do is keep making these points and hope that public opinion catches on, as I think it is, and hope that the president, even with a figurative gun at his head, does the right thing. I mean, I think if you looked at President Obama as he, pulled himself away from the links and gave that press conference, he knows that things are not going well. This cannot be so easily spun. Debbie Wasserman Schultz can't go on Nightline and explain this away. We're being reminded, as if we need reminding, that it's a dangerous world out there, and when the United States lets its guard down, the world gets in trouble. So I think the only thing people like you and I can do is keep hammering away, hope that Congress doesn't make foreign policy. Congress can criticize, it can withdraw funds, it can, suggest this, can hope for that, but it's the executive who makes the real decisions, and they need to step up their game in foreign policy, which is usually not considered a political winner. Most people are more interested in domestic issues. But I think at least according to the public opinion polls, events around the world are having an effect on public opinion. We could actually see not only these forthcoming off-year elections, but even perhaps the presidential election might actually be a referendum on foreign policy, which it usually is not. But if things are sufficiently serious It could be, and that's where people in public life play their role.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Folks, we're speaking right now with Philip Terzian, who's the literary editor with the Weekly Standard. And, of course, we were discussing his recent opinion article in the Wall Street Journal. I think we have another threat that my co-host is joining us briefly, but John and I have been discussing something for years now, and that is the radicalization of extreme Islam, not only abroad, but domestically. And I think one of the threats that the media, I don't mean you and I mean the general mainstream media
Sure.
is now almost recognizing, which is shocking because this isn't anything new, is the fact that there are Americans or British or French or other nations, even India. I see tweets coming out from India of Indian nationals who are joining up with ISIS or ISIL or IS, whatever you want to call them.
Yes.
But what happens not only when they come home, but what about the ones who are still here?
Well, that's a problem. I would think it's a greater problem in Europe than it is here, because there seems to be a greater concentration of what we would call radical Islam in Europe than there is in the United States. Part of the problem is, of course, that the Europeans, as we are to some degree, are acutely conscious of, shall we say, the racial history of Europe, and so they're very uncomfortable painting a broad brush about Muslims. And there's no question, it's certainly in my mind, that the vast majority of Muslims in the world are peace-loving people who thoroughly, after all, the victims of ISIS in Iraq are fellow Muslims. So this isn't a Muslims against the world situation. It's a problem of Islam, and I think there's more of that element of radical Islam in Europe, and there's a kind of disinclination. Europe is full of laws about making public pronouncements about groups and so on. And we have a much more freewheeling attitude about that sort of thing. And you always read these stories in the press where X number of ISIS fighters are from Sweden or from Germany or Britain or whatever, and in fact they usually are not Swedes or Germans or Britons. They're usually Pakistanis or Turks or what have you who happen to be residing in those countries. But it's a problem, and it's a problem too, if they come home. You have that spectacular case in Belgium where an ISIS fighter returned home from fighting in Syria and walked into I think it was a Jewish community center in Brussels and gunned down 4 people. Those incidents are bound to happen, and I'm hoping that our security services are aware of these people and mindful of them. In fact, there's a movement afoot in France at the moment to strip ISIS fighters who leave France, who happen to be French citizens, strip them of their citizenship so they can't return to France. There is a growing consciousness about this, and of course the Islamic community itself, I think, has a responsibility to really step up and not just lightly deplore what's going on, but strongly condemn what their brothers are doing. It's a betrayal of Islam in their view, as I'm sure it is, and they need to say that, and they need to make it clear. But for, a certain percentage of the population that's kind of aimless and feckless and angry and unemployed, like this American from Chicago who was killed in Syria last week, movements like ISIS are inexplicably attractive to them. So we just need to make sure that our security agencies and law enforcement agencies are mindful of these people.
That's another excellent point. Well, let's end on a good note because I was, I guess, a little surprised because I haven't been so impressed with him lately. But I thought that David Cameron, with the British, had a very strong statement, and
yes.
I thought he really showed, he doesn't always show leadership, But here's one particular case that the Prime Minister certainly did. I welcome it. I would love to see him joined by numerous European states, by our president, by our friends in Canada. Well, he's fantastic, by the way. But I think that we need a strong coalition and a unified voice amongst all of our friends and neighbors, including those in the Middle East, to speak against this threat.
No, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, I mean, I happen to be a great admirer of David Cameron and think he's been very good on all this. I think his statement was excellent. There is a political component to it, of course, and that is that his Conservative Party is threatened to some degree from the right by the UKIP party, which is very anti-European Union, anti-foreigner, and so on. And so he's, to some degree, shoring himself up politically. But at the same time, that could work here. I mean, President Obama could easily find that his popularity and the popularity of his party plummets severely because of this. And he will, even if it's for cynical political reasons, he may actually do the right thing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Philip, we know we could find you at the weeklystandard.com, and I believe you also have in fact, I know you have a Twitter link, but could you please share that with us so our listeners could also follow you on Twitter?
Well, I'm just Philip Terzian on Twitter, one L in Philip, and anything I write is I usually post on Twitter, and I write for the Weekly Standard, of course, which, as you say, is weeklystandard.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, by the way, for the opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal. I do read. I get the paper every day. I enjoy reading it, amongst with some of the other papers, but I certainly appreciate a great opinion piece like that. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you.
And take care, and we look forward to having you back soon. Take care.
Bye.